Sophia Johnson never thought catching a bus could challenge her dignity. But when an entitled woman blocked her path with venomous words, a quiet afternoon turned into a tense standoff. Humiliation sparked defiance in Sophia's heart, forcing her to choose between backing down or standing up. What followed left the bus stunned, and one woman regretting she ever underestimated her. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the bustling bus stop. It was rush hour, and the faint hum of distant car engines mingled with the chatter of commuters. People of all kinds, students with backpacks, professionals clutching briefcases, and elders resting on benches, stood scattered in small groups, their eyes frequently darting to the road in anticipation of the next bus. Among them was Sophia Johnson, a 16-year-old girl with bright eyes and a quiet resolve that belied her years. Her satchel, worn but sturdy, hung from her shoulder, and a thin workbook peeked out from its flap. Sophia was dressed simply in a neat, pressed uniform that spoke of her aspirations. She had always believed that education was her key to a brighter future, and today, more than ever, she needed to be on time. The regional academic competition was just across town. It wasn't just any event, it was her chance to win a scholarship that could change her life. The thought of the competition had both excited and terrified her that morning, but now, standing at the crowded bus stop, she found her nerves slightly calmed. Sophia adjusted her satchel and looked down at her scuffed shoes, exhaling deeply. "Just make it there," she whispered to herself, trying to block out the noise of the crowd. Not far from her stood a woman who had been glancing in Sophia's direction for several minutes. Dressed in a neatly pressed blouse and slacks, the woman, Linda White, exuded an air of quiet entitlement. She held her designer purse tightly under her arm and shifted on her high heels, her sharp eyes darting from one face to another as though cataloging the worth of everyone around her. Linda had been having a frustrating day. The meeting at the corporate office hadn't gone as planned, her assistant had called in sick, and now, standing at this public bus stop, a place she usually avoided, felt like the final insult to her carefully curated life. She tapped her foot impatiently, her thoughts a mixture of annoyance and disdain. Her gaze fell on Sophia, standing with her satchel clutched tightly, and something about the girl's presence irritated her further. It wasn't Sophia's demeanor, or the way she stood quietly, clearly not bothering anyone. No, it was something deeper, something Linda would never admit to herself. It was Sophia's presence in a space that Linda subconsciously believed was not meant for her. The bus appeared at the end of the road, its rumbling engine audible over the noise of the street. A collective shuffle ran through the crowd as people adjusted their positions. Sophia's heart leapt at the sight of the vehicle. She stepped slightly closer to the curb, her fingers tightening on the strap of her bag. She couldn't afford to miss this bus. But just as the bus rolled to a stop, Linda took a deliberate step forward, cutting directly in front of Sophia. The woman's posture was rigid, her chin lifted in a way that communicated she had claimed the space. Sophia froze for a moment, confused but unwilling to create a scene. She adjusted her position slightly, trying to sidestep and reach the bus door. Before she could make it, Linda's voice rang out sharp, clipped, and just loud enough to catch the attention of a few nearby commuters. "Excuse me, I was here first," Linda said, her tone laced with icy authority. She didn't look at Sophia as she spoke, instead keeping her gaze fixed ahead, as though the girl weren't worth acknowledging. Sophia hesitated, her cheeks flushing. She knew she had been standing there longer, but something about Linda's voice made her pause. She wasn't sure if it was the tone, the words, or the sheer confidence with which the woman had claimed the space, but it was enough to make her take an instinctive step back. The people around them exchanged glances but said nothing. Some chose to look away, while others seemed too preoccupied with their own concerns to intervene. Sophia's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her bag tighter. She took a deep breath, trying to muster the courage to speak, but her words caught in her throat. Linda stepped forward and boarded the bus, not even sparing Sophia a glance. For a moment, Sophia stood frozen, her heart pounding as the sting of humiliation washed over her. But as she watched Linda walk confidently down the aisle, a small flicker of determination ignited in her chest. She straightened her shoulders, adjusted her satchel, and stepped onto the bus, refusing to let this moment define her. The bus door hissed shut, and the vehicle rumbled forward, leaving the stop behind. Inside, the quiet tension between the two women was palpable, though neither exchanged a word. Sophia took a seat near the back, her mind racing with thoughts of the competition ahead and the interaction she had just endured. Linda, seated near the front, stared out the window, her lips pursed. For now, The two women occupied the same space, their paths intertwined by chance. What neither of them realized was that this encounter would set into motion a chain of events. Neither could have anticipated a confrontation that would leave one humbled and the other empowered in ways neither could imagine. Sophia took a deep breath and steadied herself as she stepped closer to the bus doors. The crowd shuffled forward, each commuter eager to secure a spot inside the vehicle that had now come to a halt. The warm air was heavy with the mingling scents of exhaust fumes and freshly brewed coffee from a nearby shop. Sophia tightened her grip on the strap of her satchel, her mind laser-focused on her destination, the academic competition that could change her life. Just as she was about to step forward, Linda White moved abruptly, her designer handbag brushing against Sophia's arm. The older woman turned sharply, her lips pursed into a thin, disapproving line. "Excuse me, young lady," Linda snapped, her tone sharp enough to slice through the murmur of the crowd. "I don't believe you were here first." Sophia blinked, startled. I was standing here," she managed, her voice soft but steady. Linda straightened her posture, her height accentuated by the pointed heels she wore. "I don't think so," she said, her voice dripping with authority. Her gaze swept over Sophia, and for a moment, her expression hardened into something unmistakable disdain. A few heads turned in their direction, but no one spoke. The crowd, as crowds often do, seemed content to spectate in silence. Sophia hesitated. The knot in her stomach tightened as she looked at Linda, who stood with an air of confidence that was difficult to challenge. She tried again, her tone measured but firm. "I've been waiting here," Sophia said, stepping slightly forward to meet Linda's gaze. "I just want to get on the bus." Linda's eyes narrowed. "Well, I'm sorry, but I was here first. And even if you were, you should learn to respect your elders." Her words were loud enough to carry across the bus stop, drawing a few more curious glances. Sophia's cheeks flushed, but she stood her ground. "I do respect my elders," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "But I've been waiting too." Linda's response came swiftly, her voice raising a notch. "You people always think you can just cut in wherever you want," she said, her words laced with venom. The phrase hung in the air, and for a moment the world seemed to still. A couple of bystanders exchanged uneasy looks, but still, no one intervened. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to say something, anything, but the weight of Linda's words left her momentarily stunned. She took a step back, her grip on her satchel tightening as her vision blurred slightly. "Is there a problem here?" The bus driver's voice broke through the tension. He leaned out of the bus door, his brow furrowed. Linda turned to the driver, her tone immediately shifting to one of polite exasperation. "No problem at all," she said, gesturing towards Sophia dismissively. "Just a misunderstanding. I was here first, but she insists otherwise." The driver's eyes flicked to Sophia, who opened her mouth to speak but faltered. She felt the weight of everyone's eyes on her, waiting for her response. A voice finally came from the crowd, a man in his 40s, dressed in a construction uniform. "I think the girl was here first," he said, his tone calm but firm. Linda whipped her head around to face the man, her expression icy. "I beg your pardon." The man shrugged. "I've been standing here the whole time. She was in front of you." For a brief moment, Sophia felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly extinguished by Linda's sharp retort. "Well, that's your opinion, isn't it? Some of us have places to be, and I don't have time for these games." "Neither does she," the man replied, motioning towards Sophia. The tension rose as a few others murmured in agreement. Linda's face reddened, but she refused to back down. Instead, she turned to Sophia and hissed under her breath, "You're making a scene. Just step aside, and this will all be over." Sophia's legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. Her heart told her to fight, but her mind was clouded with doubt. Why was no one else stepping in? Why did it feel like her voice wasn't loud enough? The driver sighed and looked at the line. "Both of you get on. Let's not hold everyone up." Linda, satisfied with what she perceived as a victory, stepped onto the bus first, her heels clicking loudly on the steps. Sophia followed, her head held high despite the lump in her throat. As the bus began to fill, Linda took a seat near the front, carefully placing her handbag beside her to ensure no one else could sit there. Sophia moved toward the back, choosing a window seat where she could collect her thoughts in peace. From her seat, Sophia noticed Linda glancing back at her briefly before turning to stare out the window. The moment was over, but its impact lingered, filling the air with a quiet tension that seemed to follow both women. Sophia clenched her hands in her lap, her resolve hardening. This wasn't over, not yet. Sophia sat stiffly in her seat, her hands resting on her satchel as the bus rattled forward. The engine's hum and the occasional squeak of the brakes should have been white noise, but instead they felt thunderous, drowning out her thoughts. She couldn't stop replaying the scene at the bus stop, each word from Linda white sharp and cutting like glass. "You people always think you can just cut in wherever you want." Those words lingered in her mind, refusing to fade. Sophia wasn't naive, she knew the weight they carried. It wasn't just a phrase, it was an accusation, a dismissal of her existence, her worth, all wrapped in one venomous remark. Her cheeks still burned with humiliation, and she blinked rapidly, determined to keep tears from spilling over. She glanced out the window, the familiar cityscape rushing past in a blur. This competition was supposed to be her moment, a chance to prove herself, to secure a scholarship, to step closer to a life she had always dreamed of. But now her mind felt clouded, her confidence shaken. What if I don't make it in time? The thought gnawed at her, feeding her growing frustration. She adjusted her satchel on her lap, trying to center herself. She could feel the weight of the stares from other passengers. Some had watched the scene unfold, their gazes silently judging or sympathizing, she couldn't tell which. A young woman across the aisle gave her a small, encouraging smile, but Sophia wasn't sure how to respond. Her pride told her to sit tall, to pretend she wasn't affected, but inside, she felt like shrinking into the seat and disappearing. Near the front of the bus, Linda sat with an air of satisfaction, her handbag perched smugly on the seat beside her. She scrolled through her phone with deliberate disinterest, ignoring the occasional side glances from other passengers. She had won, in her mind, and that was all that mattered. Sophia's gaze shifted to her own reflection in the window. Her jaw tightened as she thought about the effort it had taken to get this far. Early mornings spent studying, late nights preparing, and endless encouragement from her family to believe in herself. Yet here she was, her voice silenced, her dignity bruised, all because one woman had decided she didn't belong. Why didn't I say more? Why didn't I stand up for myself? The questions swirled in her mind, each one more cutting than the last. But even as the doubt crept in, another thought began to surface, a quiet, persistent spark of defiance. Sophia straightened her back, her fingers curling into fists on her lap. No, she thought, I'm not going to let her ruin this day for me. She took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling as she tried to steady her emotions. She replayed the incident in her mind, this time imagining herself speaking up more forcefully, her voice steady and unwavering. The thought brought a faint flicker of confidence, even if it was just a hypothetical scenario. Her internal debate was interrupted when the bus jerked to a stop at a red light, and the driver muttered something under his breath. Sophia glanced toward the front and noticed Linda shifting in her seat, glancing back at her briefly before returning to her phone. It was a small gesture, but it reignited the frustration in Sophia's chest. The bus began to move again, and Sophia felt a growing need to act, to do something that would reclaim her dignity. She glanced around the bus, taking in the faces of the other passengers. A few were focused on their phones, some stared out the window, and others sat with quiet expressions of unease, as if they were processing what had just happened. A young man in a hoodie caught her attention. He was sitting 2 rows ahead of her, his head turned slightly as though he had been watching her. When their eyes met, he gave a small nod of acknowledgement, his expression unreadable but not unkind. It wasn't much, but it felt like a tiny lifeline, a reminder that not everyone was indifferent. But what now? Sophia asked herself. Confronting Linda again seemed impossible. What could she say that wouldn't make the situation worse? And yet, sitting silently felt like giving Linda exactly what she wanted: power. Her fingers fumbled with the strap of her satchel as she considered her options. As the bus neared her destination, the knot in her stomach tightened. The competition was less than an hour away, and she couldn't afford to be late. She glanced at her watch, the minutes slipping away faster than she liked. But even with the pressure of time weighing on her, the question of how to respond to Linda lingered. It wasn't just about the bus stop anymore, it was about all the moments in her life where she had felt dismissed or diminished, about proving to herself that she could rise above it. The bus jolted to another stop, and a few passengers shuffled off. Sophia watched as an elderly man hesitated near Linda's seat, clearly looking for a place to sit. Linda barely glanced up, her handbag remaining firmly on the seat beside her. The man moved further down the aisle, and something inside Sophia snapped. She stood up, clutching her satchel tightly, and took a step forward. Her heart pounded as she approached the front of the bus, her eyes fixed on Linda. She didn't have a plan, just a burning need to reclaim the moment. Every step felt heavy, the eyes of the remaining passengers following her movements. As she neared Linda, the older woman glanced up, her expression a mixture of surprise and annoyance. Sophia stopped a few feet away, her voice steady but firm. "Excuse me," she said, loud enough for others to hear. Linda raised an eyebrow. "Yes," she replied, her tone curt. Sophia's gaze flicked to the handbag occupying the seat. "That seat is for someone who needs it. Maybe you should move your bag." The words weren't shouted, but they carried weight, slicing through the tense air like a blade. For a moment Linda said nothing, her face betraying a flicker of uncertainty. Sophia didn't wait for a response. She turned and addressed the elderly man standing near the middle of the bus. "Sir, there's a seat up here if you'd like." The man hesitated, glancing between Sophia and Linda, before finally making his way forward. Linda muttered something under her breath, reluctantly moving her bag as the man sat down. Sophia returned to her seat, her heart racing but her resolve intact. The small act didn't undo what had happened at the bus stop, but it felt like a step toward reclaiming her voice. As the bus rolled on, Sophia allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The day wasn't over yet, and neither was her fight. The bus rolled to a stop at a crowded intersection, the rhythmic hiss of its brakes interrupting the steady hum of the engine. Outside, pedestrians scurried across crosswalks, oblivious to the tension brewing inside. Sophia sat stiffly in her seat, her eyes flickering between the window and Linda White, who remained seated near the front, engrossed in her phone. Sophia's small act of defiance moments earlier speaking up for the elderly man had given her a sliver of confidence, but the sting of humiliation still lingered. She clenched her hands in her lap, replaying the confrontation at the bus stop over and over. Why can't people like her just leave me alone? As the bus prepared to move again, a man's voice cut through the tense atmosphere. "Excuse me, Mom," the driver called out, his tone firm and direct. Heads turned toward the front as the bus driver, a middle-aged man with a no-nonsense demeanor, glanced in Linda's direction through the rearview mirror. "You can't reserve that seat with your bag. Please make it available for other passengers." Linda looked up, startled. "I beg your pardon," she said, her voice sharp with indignation. The driver adjusted his cap and repeated, "The seat next to you. It's for passengers, not bags. I need you to move it." Murmurs rippled through the bus as passengers watched the scene unfold. Linda's face flushed a deep red as she glanced around, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden attention. "Well, I don't see anyone who needs it," she replied, her voice tight. Sophia's gaze locked on Linda, her pulse quickening. She had hoped for some form of accountability, but this moment felt bigger than she had imagined. From a few seats away, the elderly man who had previously been denied the seat cleared his throat. "Actually, I could use that seat," he said, his voice steady but pointed. Linda stiffened, her fingers tightening around the strap of her handbag. For a moment, it seemed like she might argue, but the weight of the collective stares bearing down on her forced her hand. With an exaggerated sigh, she picked up her bag and placed it on her lap. "Fine," she muttered, her tone dripping with resentment. The elderly man nodded politely and took the seat, but the tension in the air was palpable. Before the bus could lurch forward again, another voice rang out from the middle of the aisle. "Funny how you're quick to move when you're called out," a young woman said, her tone sharp and unapologetic. She was seated 2 rows behind Linda, her curly hair pulled back into a loose bun, her gaze steady and unyielding. "But earlier you were all too happy to block someone else from getting on the bus." Linda turned her head sharply, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the rows for the speaker. "Excuse me," she said, her voice rising defensively. "You heard me," the young woman replied, folding her arms. "I saw what you did at the bus stop. That girl," she gestured toward Sophia, "was standing there before you. But you couldn't handle that, could you?" A collective murmur spread through the bus as more passengers began to connect the dots. Sophia's heart raced as all eyes turned to her. She wanted to shrink into her seat, but the warmth of the young woman's support gave her courage. Linda scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "I don't know what you're talking about." This girl, she sneered, her words laced with venom, was being disrespectful. "I simply asserted my place." The young woman leaned forward, her eyes blazing. "Disrespectful? For standing where she had every right to stand? Please. We all saw you push your way in like you owned the place." Before Linda could respond, the driver cut the engine, turning fully to address the bus. "All right, that's enough," he said, his voice calm but commanding. He looked directly at Linda. "I don't tolerate behavior like that on my bus." If you can't treat everyone here with respect, you're welcome to step off at the next stop. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Linda's mouth opened and closed as if she were trying to formulate a response, but no words came. Wait, what? She finally sputtered. You're telling me to get off the bus because I defended myself. No, ma'am, the driver replied evenly. I'm asking you to get off if you can't treat passengers fairly. I don't care what excuse you have, blocking someone from boarding isn't acceptable. And from what I've heard, that's exactly what you did. Sophia's chest tightened as the moment unfolded. She felt a surge of vindication but also a pang of anxiety. Would Linda really be removed? Linda looked around desperately, her eyes darting to the faces of the other passengers. Most avoided her gaze, while a few shook their heads in disapproval. Sophia caught the eye of the young woman who had spoken up earlier, and they exchanged a small nod of solidarity. I'm not going anywhere, Linda declared, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. The driver's expression hardened. That's your choice, but if you don't get off willingly, I'll have to call transit security. And trust me, they won't take long to get here. Linda's face crumpled as she realized she had no way out. Grabbing her bag, she stood abruptly, her movements jerky with frustration. This is ridiculous, she muttered, her voice barely audible over the murmurs of the crowd. As she shuffled toward the exit, she cast one last glare at Sophia. You should be ashamed of yourself, she spat, her words venomous, but hollow. Sophia met her gaze, her own eyes steady and unflinching. For the first time she felt no fear, no hesitation, only resolve. Linda stepped off the bus, her figure retreating into the distance as the door hissed shut behind her. The bus jolted forward, and a quiet murmur filled the space. Sophia felt the tension begin to dissipate, replaced by a sense of relief. The young woman who had spoken up moved closer, sitting beside her. You okay? The woman asked gently. Sophia nodded, her voice soft but steady. Yeah, thanks for saying something. The woman smiled. Sometimes people need to be reminded they're not as untouchable as they think. Sophia allowed herself a small smile, her shoulders relaxing for the first time since the ordeal began. As the bus neared her destination, she realized that while the day hadn't gone as planned, she had gained something unexpected, a newfound confidence in herself and the quiet power of solidarity. The air inside the bus seemed lighter after Linda White's dramatic exit, but the echoes of her words still lingered in Sophia's mind. She sat quietly, her fingers tracing the worn edges of her satchel as the bus rumbled toward its next stop. The young woman who had spoken up for her earlier had returned to her seat, and Sophia's gaze remained fixed on the blurred cityscape outside the window. She had stood her ground, even if only in small ways. Linda had been forced to leave, humiliated in front of the very crowd she had sought to dominate, but Sophia wasn't sure if she felt triumphant. Did it really change anything? She wondered, the question weighing on her heart. The bus jerked to a halt, pulling her from her thoughts. A few passengers disembarked, their chatter filling the air, and new ones climbed aboard. Sophia's eyes scanned the crowd absently, her mind still wrestling with the events of the past hour. As the bus resumed its journey, a man in a neatly pressed suit stepped forward. He looked to be in his late 40s, with sharp features softened by a warm smile. He approached the driver first, exchanging a brief word that Sophia couldn't quite hear, before turning toward the passengers. Excuse me, folks, he said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone used to addressing a room. I couldn't help but overhear what happened earlier. The passengers quieted, their attention now fixed on the man. Sophia's pulse quickened, unsure of where this was heading. The man's gaze landed on her, kind but firm. Miss, would you mind stepping up for a moment? Sophia hesitated, shrinking slightly under the weight of the collective gaze, but something in the man's tone compelled her to stand. She clutched her satchel as she made her way toward him, her steps slow but steady. When she reached the front of the bus, the man extended his hand. I'm Anthony Green, he said, his smile encouraging. I'm the regional director for the City Transit Authority. Sophia blinked, momentarily stunned. She shook his hand, murmuring, I'm Sophia Johnson. Nice to meet you, Sophia, Anthony said, his voice carrying an undercurrent of respect. He turned back to the passengers, his expression turning serious. What I witnessed earlier was unacceptable. This young woman was treated unfairly, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. Prejudice has no place on our buses or anywhere else, for that matter. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Anthony continued, Sophia, I want to personally apologize for what you experienced today. No one should have to endure that, and I want you to know that the Transit Authority will be addressing this incident. Sophia's cheeks flushed. But this time it wasn't with embarrassment. She felt a strange mix of gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. Anthony wasn't finished. He turned back to the passengers. "And to everyone here, I hope this serves as a reminder. We all have a responsibility to speak up against injustice when we see it. I'm grateful to those of you who did today." The young woman who had spoken up earlier gave a small, satisfied nod. Unbeknownst to Sophia, Linda White's day had taken a turn for the worse. As she stomped away from the bus stop, her frustration bubbling over, she failed to notice the small group of bystanders filming the scene on their phones. One of them, a young man who had been quietly observing from a nearby bench, uploaded the footage to social media with a caption that read, "Entitled Woman Blocks Teen from Boarding a Bus. Watch what happens next." Within hours, the video gained traction, the comments section filling with outrage. Disgusting behavior. Imagine being this bitter in life. Karma got her good. Linda's name, face, and actions were plastered across social media platforms. By the time she arrived home, her phone buzzed incessantly with messages from acquaintances, some expressing disbelief, others outright condemning her behavior. Her carefully curated image, one of poise, professionalism, and superiority, began to crumble. Emails from colleagues hinted at strained relationships, and a call from her employer left her pale-faced. "We need to have a discussion about conduct," her manager had said curtly before hanging up. Back on the bus, the weight in Sophia's chest had begun to lift. Anthony returned to his seat, and the ride continued smoothly. As they approached her stop, she prepared to disembark, but before she could leave, the young woman who had defended her called out. "Hey, Sophia," she said with a grin. "You're pretty badass, you know that." Sophia smiled shyly but felt a spark of pride. "Thanks," she replied, her voice carrying a hint of newfound confidence. As she stepped off the bus and made her way toward the community center, where the academic competition was being held, her steps felt lighter. She entered the building, her nerves replaced with determination. The competition was fierce, but Sophia held her ground. Question after question, challenge after challenge, she gave it her all, her mind sharp and focused. By the end of the event, the results were announced. Sophia Johnson had placed first, securing the scholarship she had worked so hard for. That evening, as Sophia sat with her family, sharing the day's events, she reflected on the journey. The confrontation on the bus hadn't been easy, but it had taught her an important lesson. Standing up for herself wasn't just about the moment, it was about refusing to let others define her worth. Meanwhile, Linda White sat in her quiet, darkened home, scrolling through the endless stream of comments condemning her actions. The world had seen her for who she truly was, and the sting of public shame was a harsh reminder that actions have consequences. For Sophia, the day ended with a sense of victory, not just in the competition, but in the quiet triumph of knowing she had persevered, even when the odds were stacked against her. The evening air was cool as Sophia sat on her bed, her notebook open but untouched. The events of the day lingered in her mind like a vivid dream, one she couldn't quite shake. Her fingers traced the embossed edge of the certificate she had won earlier, the scholarship award that symbolized so much more than just academic achievement. It wasn't just about the competition anymore. It was about what she had faced, endured, and overcome. The weight of Linda White's words, the humiliation at the bus stop, and the simmering anger she had carried were still fresh, but something else had taken root within her resilience. Her mother entered the room, her soft footsteps breaking Sophia's train of thought. "You've been quiet tonight," she said, sitting down beside her daughter. Sophia looked up, her eyes thoughtful. "It's just everything that happened today." Her mother nodded, her expression calm and understanding. "You handled yourself well, Sophia. It wasn't easy, but you stood up for yourself. And that takes courage." Sophia let out a small sigh, her shoulders relaxing. It didn't feel like courage at the time. I just couldn't let her get away with it. Her mother reached out and squeezed her hand. "That's the thing about courage, it doesn't always feel loud or bold. Sometimes it's just doing what you know is right, even when it's hard." Sophia thought about the young woman on the bus who had spoken up for her, about Anthony Green's kind and validating words, and about the passengers who had nodded in quiet agreement. In the moment, their support had felt small, but now she realized its true significance. "They didn't have to help me," she said, her voice quiet. "But they did," her mother replied with a smile. "Because standing up for what's right inspires others to do the same." Sophia nodded, the lesson sinking in. She had always thought strength came from doing things on her own, but today had shown her the power of community, of voices rising together to confront injustice. Her fingers brushed against her satchel, the one she had clung to so tightly earlier that day. It no longer felt like a weight now. It was a reminder of her determination. Across town, in a dimly lit living room, Linda White sat on her sofa, her laptop open on the coffee table. Her name and face had spread across social media like wildfire, the video of her behavior gaining thousands of views. The comments stung more than she had anticipated. Entitled and disgusting. Another example of why we need to call out racism when we see it. Good for the girl who stood up to her. Linda's phone buzzed with yet another notification. She reached for it hesitantly, her stomach churning as she read the latest email from her employer. We take matters of this nature seriously. Please be prepared to discuss this incident during your next review. Her carefully constructed world of polished appearances and quiet entitlement was unraveling, and she couldn't stop it. For the first time in years, Linda felt something foreign and uncomfortable self-doubt. She replayed the confrontation in her mind, trying to justify her actions, but the excuses felt hollow. The anger she had directed at Sophia, the smug satisfaction of asserting her perceived superiority, what had it all been for? She stared at her reflection in the darkened window, the weight of public shame pressing down on her. Whether she truly learned from this moment or simply resented the consequences, one thing was clear: her actions would serve as a warning to others. The next morning, Sophia woke to a flood of messages on her phone. Her inbox was filled with congratulatory notes from classmates and teachers who had heard about her win at the competition. But what surprised her most were the messages from strangers, people who had seen the video of the bus incident. "You're so brave for standing up to her. Thank you for being an inspiration. My daughter watched your story, and it sparked an important conversation for us." Sophia scrolled through the messages, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and gratitude. She hadn't expected her experience to resonate with so many people, but it had. Later that day, she met with Anthony Green at the community center. He had reached out to her after the incident, offering not just an apology but also an opportunity. "We're launching a new program to address discrimination on public transit," he explained, handing her a pamphlet. "We'd love for you to be involved. Your voice could make a real difference." Sophia's eyes widened as she read the details. The program would include workshops, community discussions, and a platform for people to share their experiences. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "Say you'll think about it," Anthony replied with a smile. "You've already shown how powerful your voice can be. This is just the next step." Sophia nodded, feeling a spark of excitement. For the first time, she saw how her experience could ripple outward, creating change far beyond that bus ride. As Sophia stepped off the bus, the weight of the day lifted, replaced by a quiet sense of triumph. She had stood her ground, faced prejudice head-on, and emerged stronger. Somewhere, Linda White was left grappling with the consequences of her actions, a reminder that justice finds its way. For Sophia, this was just the beginning, a spark that would light the path to a future where courage, not hate, defined the story. What would you have done in Sophia's shoes? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories that inspire and challenge us to stand for what's right.